Welcome back to the Sales Pulse podcast. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect. Today, let's talk about something sellers never see coming. It's the 1% in the sales conversation that loses the sale. It's not the 99%, it's the 1%. I just read something with a story that was very, very interesting. It was talking about someone was ready to launch their 100-foot boat, and the engineer told them it was 99% complete. That sounds pretty good, right? So they say, ready to launch? You're smart enough to have an inspection before you launch. And then you discover there's one giant hole in the bottom. If you leave the dock with that boat, you'll be sunk. So now imagine having a great meal, a family recipe, a lasagna that your mom makes, and it's 99% as good as the best lasagna ever made. No one's going to complain. Nobody sends it back. Everyone eats dinner, goes home happy. Same percentage, 99%, sounds good, right? Yet the outcome of a great lasagna dinner is totally different than a sinking ship. I started thinking about sales conversations. And I've discovered that most sellers spend their time trying to improve the wrong 1%. Many sellers are polishing features and benefits and practicing objections. They're handling things that they really have no control over. It's great to have your information organized, but the buyer creates the conversation. They're polishing features and benefits, things that don't really matter as much as you think they do. I know you've been told that. I was told that. I practiced features and benefits until I was blue in the face. But I realized they had no value if they had no relationship to the buyer. Sellers that are trying to move from good to great when there's a hole in the ship will still sink the sale. Many of you are trying to perfect a script, find the perfect opening line, create the great follow-up message, and the perfect response to every possible objection in the world. You tweak, you edit, you memorize, you rehearse. But you're surprised and you're frustrated when conversations fail or stall. Everything in the conversation didn't go wrong, but there was one thing missing, that one important thing. It was the one unanswered question. It was the one assumption you made. It was that one piece of information that never surfaced that was essential for the buyer to say yes. It was one of those buyer concerns that never got explored. You know, that little side comment they make and you just ignored it and went on? Or it's one decision-making factor that never got discussed, or it's an emotion from the buyer that never got acknowledged and explored. One of these missing pieces is as large as that hole in the ship. And that's how you sink an entire sales conversation. I've seen it happen many times as I sat in sales conversations for coaching. I was in live conversations, listening and watching sales sink themselves. And of course, I could only coach after the call. So that was the moment of reality for them. And I only hoped that they did better the next time. Sellers do almost everything right. They build rapport, they explain clearly, they answer questions, they provide examples, they do follow up, and they stay professional. Yet when a buyer walks away, you have to wonder why. It could be, and most often is, that the seller never discovered the one key thing that really mattered to the buyer. Maybe the buyer was worried about timing. Maybe they were overwhelmed in having to even make a decision or a choice. Maybe they didn't understand how the process for the program they were going to buy would work, or even the buying process. Maybe they needed to discuss it with someone else. Maybe they weren't sure the outcome was going to be worth the effort. Maybe they didn't trust themselves to make the decision. You, the seller, could have addressed 20 things, but if you miss the one thing, the boat will not float. One of the most common examples I see is when a buyer says, I need to think about it. The average seller immediately starts looking for an answer. They want to satisfy the buyer. They're guessing and throwing more information out. And that's very often the wrong move. I need to think about it is not information, it's a signal, it's a red light. The question isn't how do I respond? The question is, what are they trying to sort through? And then you ask that question. What is it you'd like to sort through? Makes it very simple, keeps you out of trouble. When you respond too quickly, you're solving a problem you don't actually understand. You're patching holes, all the while ignoring the one that's under the waterline. So this is where curiosity becomes most powerful in sales. Curiosity will always help us find the missing 1%. Curiosity helps us discover what's actually going on for the buyer. Curiosity prevents us from making assumptions because assumptions are very expensive for us. And I've said for years, there are no objections. There was simply something important that was missed or a question that was not asked. When my clients hear that, they sometimes push back. But think about it. Most so-called objections are really information gaps. The buyer doesn't have enough clarity to make a quality yes or no decision. The seller doesn't have enough understanding about how well your offer will serve them. When something is missing, the conversation isn't broken, it's incomplete. The challenge for the sellers is to focus on what was not said, not on what was said. Focus on what was not said, and you will find the missing 1%. So ask yourself when you're looking for that 1%, what question didn't get asked? What concern didn't get explored? What emotion did not get acknowledged? What assumption did I make? Ask those and you'll find the hole in your sales conversation. Now here's the interesting part. Most people with a lot of sales experience miss the 1% easier than those of you beginning in sales. Why? Because they have experience and it's created a confidence that makes them stop listening. That confidence in having many conversations before leads to more assumptions rather than fewer assumptions. And I've seen it before. Somebody brings something up in the conversation and the seller will say, I know the answer. I know where this conversation is headed. I know what the buyer means. So when we stop being curious and we start letting assumptions run the sale, we're flooding the boat. The best sellers I know have not been the most persuasive, but they were the most observant. They listened carefully. They noticed patterns in the seller's interests and reactions and side comments. They paid attention to hesitations, and they always asked one more question. They slowed down when the buyer sped up, and they sped up when the buyer sped up. They weren't hunting for perfect responses. They were looking for the missing piece, the missing trigger, the 1% that the buyer really needed in order to say yes. The partnership between seller and buyer, that thing we call trust, increases when it becomes easier for the buyer to make situational sense of what you're both talking about. So sales conversations are more successful when they're more curious about the buyer. Before your next sales conversation, stop worrying about approving the 99% of your sales conversation and instead ask yourself, what might be the 1% I'm missing in my sales conversations? What haven't I asked my buyers? What haven't I understood about buyers? What might this buyer be willing to sort through? Most conversations don't fail because everything went wrong. They fail because buyer criteria never came into view, was never acknowledged, was not discovered. The goal in all sales conversations is to be present for the buyer. Find that 1%. Don't sink that sales conversation because you are not curious. Be curious. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Sales Pulse podcast. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect. Subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And until next time, make sales happen one clear, curious conversation at a time.